I have way too much information, but I've done my best to condense it, but I'm going to go quickly. So what I did is I put the presentation on mrm.org/scripture. I was in Washington last week and I spoke, and somebody said to me, a lady came up and said, "You speak really fast, I can't take notes." And I said, "I'm sorry, that's just the way I am. I have all this information to present." So if you're somebody who likes to take notes, maybe you can look at that and get whatever you missed. But I'm hoping this is going to be helpful. Article 8 in the Articles of Faith by Joseph Smith, 8th article. If you're a former Latter-day Saint, you all know that it said the Bible is true as far as it is translated correctly. What I want to do is I want to take the first 2 chapters out of my new book that came out last year, Introducing Christianity to Mormons, and I spent 2 of the 10 chapters going over the Bible, because I have found that one of the things when people do leave the LDS Church is they don't have a very high view of the Bible, and I think that's a shame. And so what we're going to do is I want to give you assurances that the Bible can be trusted, and that it's wrong to say, if you mean translated the way that the word itself means, it's wrong. So we're going to overview those chapters with this presentation, and hopefully it will make sense to you. I'm going to read out of my book. It's kind of fun to be an author, to be able to read out of your book. So story time. If you want to get on the carpet, you're not. High school students would do that when I would read from a children's book. But I'm going to read from it and just help introduce this. Dave approached me on a warm early summer evening while I was passing out Christian information in Salt Lake City. "Do you believe the Bible with its many problems?" he asked as we stood across from each other on the public sidewalk. He didn't give me a chance to answer before he continued. "Our church has produced a document called the Articles of Faith. The 8th article of faith states, we believe the Bible to be the Word of God as far as it is translated correctly. While the Bible is part of our Scripture, we are aware it cannot be fully trusted." Now put yourself in that spot. If this person is talking to you, you probably have a lot of things running through your mind. Where do you start with this huge, huge topic? And a very important topic at that. And so I want you to think, how would you deal with it? I'm going to show you how I dealt with it, and this presentation will be pretty much extension of this conversation. Because, as mentioned, Article 8 says, we believe the Bible to be the Word of God as far as it is translated correctly. So before we could continuing reading from my book, I needed to distinguish the difference between the meanings of translation and transmission. This is the most important thing you can do when Article 8 is brought out. And so I asked, in your mind, what does translation mean? I think a lot of Latter-day Saints who quote that don't really understand what that means. And he said this. He says, it's taking words from one language and putting them into another, like from Spanish into English, he said. Exactly, I responded. If that is what is meant, I would agree that a bad translation of the Bible is possible. There are bad translations in English. Have you heard of the Jehovah's Witnesses and the New World Translation? They've taken the words and made it fit their own theology. So for instance, John 1:1, which says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. They actually use a God, because Jesus is not God according to Jehovah's Witness theology. It's a bad translation, and it's been proven to be so. No reputable Bible scholar thinks that it's a good translation. So the real problem is, does Article 8 describe a translation problem? Not if translation means taking words from one language and moving them together. LDS leaders have been very clear that somehow there were corrupt priests in the Catholic Church, scribes, whatever you want to call them, that were taking the Bible and they were writing them out, and they were changing things they didn't like. And that would be very much an idea that many Latter-day Saints would have. And so that's not translation, that is transmission. Now we need to understand, how did we get the Bible? What is the Bible? Well, we believe it's God's special revelation. And so this chart here is for me to try to help you understand that the Bible for biblical Christianity is about understanding what God's mind is. What is God thinking as far as what is reality, what is truth, what is what we're supposed to believe, the doctrines and all of those things, the mind of God, and then how are we supposed to act and the attitude that we're supposed to have. Well, there's different links in the chain, and you have to have all of these down in order to be able to understand where are we, how do we get God's Word? How do we understand that? Does it come by personal revelation? Does it come from a man who's a prophet who tells us what to believe? Or is it something more? And in the Bible, with the Bible being the centerpiece here, there's 5 different aspects. The first chain, and if you break this chain it's not going to work, is called revelation. And there's 2 types of revelation, and I'm going to summarize it as best I can. There's general revelation in Psalm chapter 19, which says the heavens declare the glory of God. Generally, all people have been told that there is some kind of a higher power. I think that's why in the world's population, about 90% of people believe in some kind of a power, even if it's animistic, that they believe in something beyond us. And so that would be general revelation. And then special revelation for us as Christians is the Bible. Is God specifically telling us what we're supposed to believe. The second one is inspiration. It says in 2 Timothy 3:16 that God's Word is inspired and can be trusted for doctrine, for reproving, for training in righteousness, that God breathed that. That's the actual word used in 2 Timothy 3:16. The third is preservation, and this is where I think a lot of Latter-day Saints don't understand how well preserved the Bible is, and that's what I'm going to be talking mainly about in this presentation here today. The fourth is translation. Taking the Greek and the Hebrew and Aramaic, the Hebrew and the Aramaic would be the Old Testament, and the New Testament, Koine Greek, and then taking that and moving it into a language that people can understand. For us here, it would be English. And then finally, you could have all 4 of those down and really understand all that, but if you improperly interpret it, it's going to break the chain, the whole thing falls apart, you're not going to know how you're supposed to live, what you're supposed to believe. Does that make sense? That chain, all of those parts have to be in place. And I think for the most part, Article 8 is not going after the 4th link, it's going after the 3rd link. And that's what I'm going to be emphasizing here. The criticism of the Bible is very obvious. Joseph Smith, the founder, said, "I believe the Bible as it is read when it came from the pen of the original writers. Ignorant translators, careless transcribers, or designing and corrupt priests have committed many errors." So this starts from the very beginning, top down. Joseph Smith did not actually hold to the Bible as it was translated. He actually came out with his own translation called the Joseph Smith translation, or the Inspired Version, that came out. He finished it actually in July of 1833. History of the Church, Volume 1, page 368 says, "Today I finished the translation." That Bible, that translation is a loose translation because he didn't know Greek. He dabbled in it a little bit. Hebrew he didn't know. And so he basically took the King James and he put his own corrections in. But that Bible is used oftentimes by the church in its writings, in its curriculum, in its church magazines. The Liahona magazine continually translates or gives that translation. And then the Quad actually has notes from the Joseph Smith inspired version. So anyway, he did not hold that. So he supposedly fixed things. LDS criticism from Gordon Hinckley and Thomas Monson and Ezra Taft Benson. The Bible, as it has been transmitted over the centuries, has suffered the loss of many plain and precious parts. And that's a quote out of the Standard Works. This is from 1992. The First Presidency wanted its people to know that it's not something you can really trust because of all the parts, the problem. So when we have all of these things together correctly, when we understand revelation, general and special, when we understand inspiration, when we understand preservation, when we understand the translation and getting a quality translation of the Bible, and there are many good ones out there. I mean, I don't know what you like to use. There's really popular ones. NIV, ESV, NASB, those are some of the most popular Bibles evangelical Christians like to use. And then you've got to have that interpretation. That's when you're going to be able to have illumination and application. That's the only way you can do that. That's what pastors do. When the pastor gets up here on Sunday morning, he is expositing the Bible, whatever passage. I love it when they go through a whole book of the Bible to catch it all in context. And they're trying to explain it, not just what it meant back then, but how can we apply it today without contextualizing it for the 21st century. But what did the writer say, and how are we supposed to live? Well, as far as the preservation, I'm going after that third link, and I want to protect that. I want to talk about how we know that the Bible has been well preserved. And one of the best things we can do is go, for the Old Testament, is go to the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were discovered between 1947 and 1954. An Arab boy threw a rock. In fact, I'm standing in front of that with my friend Josh. That's the hole up there where a boy threw a rock in and it broke. And so they ended up finding these manuscripts. Long story, but this is Cave 1. We hiked up to Cave 1. This is not where most tourists get to see, but I have an archaeologist friend who takes us up there. And so we can go inside the cave today where 5 or 6 major scrolls were found, as well as others. And then they determined, the scholars realized there were gold in them there hills, and so they ended up finding these other 10 caves. Close to 1,000 ancient scrolls found, mostly in fragments. In fact, in Cave 4, they found a number of fragments, over 500 different fragments that were made of papyrus, and they had just disintegrated. A quarter of the scrolls were Old Testament, but all but one book was found, Esther, and they found a commentary called the Pesher. They found that there, so they know that Esther was not left out. They just didn't find any, but they put a lot of energy. The Essene people, they were an offshoot. They were like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They lived out in near the Dead Sea and had their own community, and that was their main job, was copying down the different scrolls so they could preserve them. So Qumran, you can see that it's at the northwest side of the Dead Sea. And like I say, I go to Israel. I was there twice in February. I'm going again in November. I like to take people there, and we like to see this and experience it for ourselves. In fact, we climb up to Cave 1. There's a group climbing up, and my friend Joel Kramer is in the middle between Bill McKeever and myself inside the cave. So it's just kind of fun to actually go there. It's empty today, but it is a real place. The Dead Sea Scrolls, when they found them, they put them together, and what it did is it helped us to understand that the Old Testament we had from what's called the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text was a different kind of Hebrew that included vowels, and it's dated about 1000 AD. So the scrolls that they found, in fact, including the Great Scroll of Isaiah, they date that to about 125 BC. So this bridged the gap by over 1,000 years. And so the question is, what can we learn from the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, according to Sidney Perry, who was an LDS scholar, he said, after reading the scrolls very carefully, I come to the conclusion that there is not a line in them that suggests that their writers knew the gospel as understood by Latter-day Saints. In fact, there are a few passages that seem to prove the contrary, because there were many Latter-day Saints at the time who were saying this was going to prove that the doctrines of Mormonism were true to help illuminate. Now, you have to understand there were a lot of different writings in there besides the Bible. Only 25% were of the Old Testament. Another 25% were of the Apocrypha. Another 25% were the Pseudepigrapha. And then another 25% were the sect's own beliefs, their own teachings. And they were kind of a unique group, the Essenes. But the Dead Sea Scrolls is not a support of Mormonism. What they did find, and the most valuable, was the Great Scroll of Isaiah, that complete from chapter 1 through chapter 66. I forget how many feet it is. It's like 27 feet. And that scroll is dated between 125 to 100 BC. This is before the time of Jesus. That's so important. This is before the time. Written on animal skin, called vellum, and it was housed in a jar in Cave 1, and it was practically identical with the oldest copy of the Masoretic text. A century had gone, or a millennium had gone by, and what they discovered is it was so close that there were some differences, but it involved an accent mark, a few accent marks, and so it's about 95% the same, 5% differences, and the changes really don't have any differences with what the original scroll had from 125. No doctrine was affected. If you're going to, there's 39 books of the Old Testament. If you're going to find one book of the Old Testament in complete form, which would have been the best book? If I had asked you that before, if I had time, I would have asked that before, and you might have said Genesis or I don't know what. I'm going to say Isaiah. Why Isaiah? Why Isaiah? Because it is incredible in its prophecies of Jesus. Remember, Isaiah 53 is just one of the many prophecies of Jesus. And if you read that, it's like you're reading exactly who Jesus was. It says it exactly the same, 125 BC. So there were people before who were saying, yeah, somebody came along and changed that and made prophecies work out for Jesus. That's not the case. That is not the case at all. And then having the multiple copies. We do not have the autographs. The autographs are the originals from either the Old or New Testament. 66 books, we don't have the autographs. But what we do have for the New Testament, we have 5,600 Greek apographs, which are copies, 5,600 in Greek. We have 24,000 in other languages. And the average size, we're not talking about a page or two, we're talking about the average size is 450 pages in length. So, and then 24,000, as I said, in additional languages besides Greek. 10 to 15 manuscripts are within 100 years of the New Testament. That's within the lifetime of the apostles. I mean, you have John was the last living apostle, and there were guys that were his apostles that certainly knew about those that were written within 100 years. 4 dozen manuscripts within 2 centuries. And of the manuscripts completed before AD 400, 99 exist today still. And the most impressive is Codex Sinaiticus. And without getting into a deep discussion as to a codex is a book. And what they started to do is they were taking the New Testament and making books out of them, out of the vellum, handwritten, because they did not have the printing press until Gutenberg comes along another 1,300 years later. And so Codex Sinaiticus, which was discovered at Mount Sinai by a guy named Tischendorf. We have Codex Vaticanus. You can guess where that's found. The Catholic Church had that, and it came out in 1400 that they had it. And then we have Codex Alexandrinus. Where those 3 codices match from the 4th century, scholars believe that's what the original would have said. Darrell Bach and Daniel Wallace say this: all told, the New Testament is represented by approximately 1,000 times, catch this, 1,000 times as many manuscripts as the average classical author's writings. Even the well-known authors such as Homer and Herodotus simply can't compare to the quantity of copies enjoyed by the New Testament. Like, for instance, the Odyssey. We do have copies of the Odyssey, and they're about 600 years after Homer wrote. That's not going to be very helpful, because 600 years we don't know what happened. With the New Testament, again, we had copies within 100 years and a number of copies in the first few hundred years. And so we have plenty of resources there. And yet, I have a degree, associate's degree in English, and I took Shakespeare, and I never heard anybody say, well, Shakespeare didn't write that. I studied the Odyssey and Iliad, and I never had anybody say, oh, we don't know if Homer wrote that. And yet the Bible, so often they're saying, well, how do we know that that is true? Well, we have a lot of manuscripts. And there are some variants, there's no doubt. There's variants. In fact, Bart Ehrman is an atheist, very popular atheist. He's out there, and he claims there are 400,000 variants, that there are differences between the different translations, or the different documents, not translations, but the actual apographs. But here's the thing. You can say 400,000. There's only 138,000 total words in 27 New Testament books. How can you have 400,000 variants? It sounds really intimidating. Well, here's the thing. Here's how they count variants. If 50 copies, we're just talking 50 of, let's say, the 5,000 plus copies in the Greek. If 50 copies had 50 variants that are all the same, that counts for 50. This one has it, this one has it, this one's a variant, this one's a variant. And that's how you get to 400,000. 75% of all of the variants involve spelling mistakes. It's not going to change the meaning of what is being written by the original author. And that's our intent. We want to find out, what did the author say? How do we understand what he meant? And then how do we apply it today? And so if it's involving spelling mistakes, we make spelling mistakes all the time. I noticed a spelling mistake I made in one of the slides. I won't point it out. I'm going to fix it. We do those things. Yes?
So just have a question. Do you think because the Catholics, we know they had a hold of Christianity for such a long time.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you think they might have changed the Bible over time?
No, because we have the manuscripts. They didn't own them all. They did own Codex Vaticanus, but it agrees for the most part with Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus. And I'm going to show you why. Stay tuned. I'm going to show you right now. I'm going to do that. Fewer than 1% are meaningful. Fewer than 1% are meaningful. Catch this. And this is not just Eric Johnson speaking. I am not a New Testament scholar. I've studied Greek, but I'm not by any means a scholar. But I'm going with what the scholarship says, and fewer than 1%. This is Craig Blomberg, a New Testament scholar. He said this in his book, Can We Still Believe the Bible? The vast majority of textual variants are wholly uninteresting except to specialists. When one hears numbers like 400,000 variants, if that number is even accurate, see, I don't think that's fair to say. One must remember they are spread across 25,000 manuscripts. A large percentage of these variants cluster around the same verses or passages. He says less than 3% of them are significant enough to be presented in one of the two standard critical editions of the Greek New Testament. Only about 1/10 of 1% are interesting enough to make their way into footnotes in most English translations. It cannot be emphasized strongly enough that no orthodox doctrine or ethical practice of Christianity depends solely on any disputed wording. Do you hear what he just said? He's saying, yes, there are variants, but they're things that can be figured out. Now, if you study Greek, there is a book that you get when you take the class in seminary, which I graduated from seminary, and it tells you what the different readings possibly are, and they rate them A, B, C, or D. If it's a D, that's not very good. And if it's an A, that means that's really what it said. There are verses that are found in our Bible today. I can't remember if I talk about 1 John 5, 7 and 8, where it's a great verse if you wanted to use it for the Trinity, except it has a D rating. It was not in the original. It's from very late manuscripts. And that is a problem. And so what Blomberg is saying is most of these, 1/10 of 1%, are interesting enough to make it into the footnotes. There were relatively few errors in the manuscripts. This is what F.F. Bruce, the New Testament scholar, passed on now, said. He said, when we have documents like our New Testament writings copied and recopied thousands of times, the scope for copyist errors is so enormously increased that it is surprising that there are no more than there actually are. Fortunately, if the great number of manuscripts increases the number of scribal errors, it increases proportionally the means of correcting such errors, so that the margin of doubt left in the process of recovering the exact wording is not so large as might be feared. It is in truth remarkably small. I'm going to recommend a book. Maybe I'm talking over some heads here, and there's a lot of information, and it is. I apologize for so much. You want a simple look at it? Read the first 7 chapters of Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ. He goes and he interviews a number of scholars because his first 7 chapters, he's saying, listen, my wife became a Christian. I'm pretty ticked off at it. I don't want Christianity to be true. I'm going to prove it to be wrong. It's interesting people do that. A guy like Lee Strobel. Josh McDowell, a guy that I know. I'm friends with his friend Sean McDowell, or his son Sean McDowell. I asked Josh one time, I said, can you imagine when you were a teenager that you would have done what he's written over 150 books and evidence that demands a verdict. And, he went out to disprove the Bible. Well, when he looked at the evidence, he couldn't help but say, oh my goodness. Another friend of mine, J. Warner Wallace, Cold Case Christianity, another book you might want to look at. He talks about this as well. There are really good lay people books I would encourage you to read, because you really need to get this down. If you can't trust the Bible in your own life, then you're not going to be able to really believe in the God of the Bible. You've got to accept the Bible as it is. And you have to understand these scholars, these these transcribers had set rules. And so when we are looking at the different copies, we're going to give priority to the earliest copies, because it is true, the longer something goes on, legends can come in. So we're not going to trust a 14th edition New Testament manuscript over a 4th century. Generally, given all things considered, we're going to give the precedence to the earliest copies. The harder the reading, the more likely it was the original, because that's where some of the errors did come in, because a scribe would read and he'd go, oh, that doesn't sound right, so he tried to fix it. We know when those things happen in some of the manuscripts, and when we take a look at all the others, it makes no sense that that should have been fixed, but he was trying to do a favor to the Bible, trying to help God out, right? We do that oftentimes as well. Let me just help him out, and they fix it, and it was the wrong thing to do. It was meant to be the harder reading. So generally, translators are going to accept the harder, because they're going to smooth it over. And then we have to look at the integrity of the translators. We have to understand what John Wycliffe, who came out with the first English Bible, it was only in Latin. You'd have to know Latin from the Vulgate from the 4th century to be able to read the Bible. And the Catholic Church didn't want people to read the Bible, so it was not available. John Wycliffe and then William Tyndale. He came around 100 years later. Those men both died, were martyrs because of their translating the Bible into English. And what the modern translators are trying to do is they try to make it understandable. I studied under Dr. Ronald Youngblood. He was a translator of the NIV Old Testament. And I studied under Wesley Walters, who was a New Testament NIV translator. I studied back in the 1980s. Under these men, and they would tell stories. It was fascinating when they would get up in class and tell stories of how they would debate between the 5 or 6 different scholars that were there of what the Bible would say, the NIV, which for many years was the most popular version of the Bible. I know that Ronald Youngblood was not trying to monkey anything. He was trying to get what the text said, the best available that they had. He did the Old Testament, and to make it make sense so that it would make sense to the modern day reader. Blomberg says this, he continues, he says, readers of almost any English translation of the Bible, except for the King James Version and the New King James, can look at the footnotes or marginal notes of their Bibles and see mention of a broad cross-section of the most important and interesting of these variants. Unfortunately, many readers don't consult these notes often enough. If you have the ESV or the NIV or those kinds of versions, you can look at the notes and it will say, some manuscripts say, and then it will tell you what it says. For instance, I don't know if you realize, John 7:53 to 8:11, the story of Jesus and the adulterous woman, is not in the earliest and most accurate manuscripts of John. Did you know that? Do you know what the NIV does? It puts a line there, it puts that note there, it gives you the verses in there, and then it draws another line. You've got to be careful about taking doctrine there. I think it's a true story. I just don't think that it was originally put there. There's questions to it. I don't think we have to base... There's no doctrine in there that we go, oh, without that we can't believe the gospel of the Bible. Another one would be... what would you have? That, and you have Mark chapter 16, verses 9 and following. That also, it's a longer ending to Mark. There's some interesting things in there, including handling snakes. Some of the churches, Pentecostal churches in the Appalachians have taken that and they play with rattlesnakes and cobras because they say, well, it's in the Bible. Well, that passage was not in the original Mark. Somebody came along and added on to it. So you can pretty much stop at verse 9. I don't hold much credence in verse 10. Your versions will have it there, but they draw a line. They want you to know, be careful with this. And certainly don't come up with a doctrine like playing with snakes based on that passage. He said, the United Bible Society's 4th edition of the Greek New Testament contains 1,438 of the most significant textual variants in its footnotes and presents the most important manuscript evidence for each reading of the disputed text. Using the letters A through D, they grade it. A is the best, D is the worst. The committee that produced the edition also ranks its level of confidence in its decision to adopt a particular reading. And here's my challenge to you. The different translations, you can actually buy 8 versions all together. The King James, the NIV, they have 8 of them together. I have this for the New Testament. And what I like to do, sometimes when I'm studying, when I'm trying to translate a passage and I'm going from the Greek and I'm trying my best, and I'm just not doing very well, I like to go look at what the different people said. And you know what? They say it differently, but they're saying the same thing most times, where you go, exactly the same. It's like reading it's like reading a newspaper. You might read a story of the team winning the game last night in the football game, and you read it in one newspaper, and you read it in another. It's a little different. It's still saying the same thing, and that's what I think is so very important to understand. Let me give you an example. Matthew 17:21, it's only in the King James. If you read your NIV, your English Standard Version, or whatever version you have, it goes from verse 20 to verse 22. What happened at 21? Go to the footnotes. It will tell you. This is where Jesus heals a boy with a demon, and this is what the King James has. Howbeit this kind goeth not out but by prayer, but by prayer and fasting. Now, of course, we believe in prayer and fasting, but remember what I said? Sometimes things happen where they would have put things in there to maybe try to help people understand, and the United Bible Society left that verse out. Now, some people are going to say, well, that's terrible. Well, no, because out of the 4 ratings, the omission is a strong B grade that they left that out. That's a very high rating to say that did not belong there, and so other modern translations today are not going to include that. It might have been adapted or added by later copyists to fit. There was another account that says that in Mark 9, so they go, well, why did they leave that? That's a really good verse. Let's throw that one in here and add that in. Well, that's not hard to do. You just leave it out, and you skip a verse. Verse 21 is not in your modern day version. That's just the way it is. You've got to kind of know that as you're reading this and not go, oh my goodness, how can I trust this Bible? Well, all they were trying to do is help it out. They didn't help it out, but now we know the rest of the story. And so they leave that verse out. And it's placed in a footnote. They're not hiding anything. Anytime, like 1 John 5, 7, and 8, you read that in the King James, it's different than your modern day version. Well, you go to the NIV or the English Standard Version, go to the bottom, and it says, some late manuscripts say, and it tells you, and it's like, whoa, that would have been perfect for the Trinity. I would not use 1 John 5, 7, and 8 to explain it's called the Johannine comma is the name of that. And so the idea when we make a change like Matthew 17:21, we're not affecting any major doctrine. How about the doctrine of the deity of Christ? The case for the real Jesus, Daniel Wallace, New Testament scholar, says it's nonsense to say Jesus' deity wasn't invented until the 4th century. When you've got the evidence in earlier manuscripts, it was very clear. Even LDS professor Lloyd Anderson said in a symposium back in 1963, listen to what he says. He says, this is a Mormon from BYU, okay? He's from BYU at the time. I don't think he's alive anymore. He said, one can disagree with the textual assumptions behind some of the modern translations of the New Testament and still not be overly concerned with differences that are immaterial. For a book to undergo progressive uncovering of its manuscript history, because we're still finding manuscripts even today, much more than he had in 63, and come out with so little debatable in its text, is a great tribute to its essential authenticity. First, no new manuscript discovery has produced serious differences in the essential story. This survey has disclosed the leading textual controversies, and together they would be well within 1% of the text. Even Norm Geisler said 98.5%, like the Ivory Sup commercial, for those of you who are old enough. Remember 98 and 5/10 pure? He says 99%. 99%. No problems whatsoever. And he says that. Stated differently, all manuscripts agree on the essential correctness of 99% of the verses in the New Testament. If you talk to a Latter-day Saint who's currently in the church, you ask, how many of the verses are tainted? Well, they can't tell you which ones, but they'll say a bunch of them. Well, how many? Thousands. I had one guy actually tell me that. Thousands. Really? Can you help me to see which thousands? There's not that many words. I mean, that would be a huge chunk of the New Testament. And 99%, this is a Latter-day Saint saying this. The second great fact that such a survey demonstrates is the progress that has placed the world in possession of manuscripts very near to the time of their writing. Now, I'm sure he held to Article 8, but he believed that the transmission of the text, not the translation, the transmission, that the Bible had been well preserved. He's saying it at a symposium in a paper that he gave called, I don't know what it's called. Well, it's called Manuscript Discoveries of the New Testament in Perspective. He goes on and says, finishes his quote, One would have to be a student of ancient history to appreciate how much superior the New Testament is to any other book in its manuscript tradition. See, I don't even have to quote Wallace and the other guys I've been quoting. Let me just quote this professor who was well esteemed. I mean, he taught at the school for decades, and this is what he said. This was his interpretation. Now, I'm going to really quickly go through. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to quickly go over the telephone game. I can't tell you how many times I hear the telephone game. It's that party game, you know, where you whisper into somebody's ear a sentence, and then it goes to the second player, and the third, and you get to the fourth. We did this in elementary school, right? And at the end, you say, well, what did the original sentence say? And they come out with something garbled, and everybody go, yeah, oh, that's great. How did that happen, you know? And so that's the game that they like to point to. So things get skewed from player to player. How, the skeptic says, can you be convinced that the original message written by the biblical writers was accurately written down, copy after copy after copy after copy? Bart Ehrman uses this argument. Well, that's a bad illustration. Apples and oranges. And it's a problem. But they're going to use that to say, well, they're going to put doubt in your mind and say, well, how do we know the Bible wasn't garbled over time? I had this gentleman, his name is Vassie. This is in my book, Introducing Christianity to Mormons. And what I did in this chart, what he did, I just took his chart, he let me use it in my book, is he showed the difference between the two. On the left-hand side is the telephone game. From one person to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. Every person in the chain passes the message on to the only one person. A change introduced by any one person will propagate through the entire chain. The message is only reported by the first person in the chain. He says what it was. Everybody made some kind of garble to it until it got really garbled at the end. That would be this direct linear model. Well, the real way that the New Testament came about was not that way. Manuscripts are copied multiple times, resulting in a complex web of relationships. A change is introduced by anyone. Let's say there is one change that's made in a family of texts. Then they can trace those, and they can know that's where this came from, this family. The text is attested in over 5,000 extant Greek manuscripts, some as early as the 2nd century. See, here's the difference between the two. The telephone game is oral. That's important to know. It's oral. It's spoken. Well, what is the transmission of the Bible? It's written. Okay? Players' lack of memory plays a role here. It does not play a role in the transmission. They just wrote down what they had in front of them. They have multiple written records of the text. And in the telephone game, you want it to be as silly as possible. In fact, you're at the end of the line, you purposely would throw some things in there that you knew probably wasn't in there, but you wanted everybody to laugh. So you come up with the craziest thing, and that's the more fun. This is not a game. Knowing Dr. Youngblood, this was not a game with him. It was real business. He's taking the Word of God. Imagine, he's writing down the words that you might memorize. I memorized a lot of NIV verses over my time. He took that seriously, and I believe all the others did as well. Now, here's the thing. Would you trade all the copies we have for an autograph? What would your answer be to yourself? It's obviously a rhetorical question. Would you trade all those copies so we could get the original from Paul or any of the gospel writers? Well, you have to ask yourself, who would own any of the Bible's autographs? And this comes to the question you were asking earlier. Who would own it? Help me. Who do you think would own it?
Catholic Church?
Probably, huh? I think that would be I'm going to the Vatican again in April. The Vatican Museum is one of the most incredible museums. But they don't have everything out there. You see a lot of things, and they billions of dollars worth of art, but you don't see everything. If they own the original, what could they do? They could change whatever they wanted with that original. Now you have no copies to change it with. You had asked the question earlier about, well, could the Catholic Church have changed it? Let's say the Catholic Church did change. Oh, we don't like that imputation idea, justification by faith alone. Let's say justification by faith alone plus baptism. They add that in there on a copy. Well, you're going to have to go find all of the copies and make that change to make it make sense. Do you see the problem they would have? The autograph, they could just do it in the original and say, you can't argue against that. We have the original. That was written by Paul. Ephesians 2:8-9, for we're saved by grace plus works, through faith as well, but you got to work. You could have done whatever they wanted. They could have made the little notes and fixed it the way they wanted. They couldn't because they didn't own it. Now, they did have an early version I mentioned earlier, but it matches what Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus, the three most important Greek codices in the world. And so,
how are we 100% sure it's the original?
Because you're taking copies from all these different sources, and they don't, so some wrote so they copied it from the original, and then there are what's called family of texts, and so they very much are consistent in the earliest copies. We have a piece of John, chapter 17, that goes to 125 AD. I mean, and it says what we have in our Bible today. So there's good resource material to understand that what we have is much better than actually having the autograph, because we have all the copies of that. And for that matter, and I got to move because I do have limited time, but think about it in the LDS perspective. If they want to criticize the Bible for what I'm talking about, then you ask the question, okay, so what about the Book of Mormon, the most correct book on earth? A man can get nearer to God by abiding by his precepts and by eating on the book. I'm sorry?
The Book of Mormon was written by a man.
Well, but you ask the Latter-day Saint, is it the same as what the gold plates had? Well, they made, Sandra Tanner has a book out that talks about the 3,000 plus changes. And so I think you're killing yourself if you're trying to say, well, how do we know we can trust that? When we have the earliest manuscript copies, read Lee Strobel's book. I think that will be a big help, listening to what the scholars are saying about this and why we can trust it. I do need to move, and then if I don't get all the way through, I don't get all the way through. I'm almost done, though. We have thousands of copies all over the world. Nobody can go in and change it, and then all the others are going to not be affected. Only that family of text would be affected. So to make changes, they'd have to do that. Go to every copy and make the same correction to say, well, that was a standard. It's not going to work. And it's ludicrous that you could even think that would happen. And it's interesting. Codex Vaticanus, which did not come out until the 15th century, in the 1400s, they didn't change that. They kept it the same. They didn't try to do any monkey business with the Codex Vaticanus, and it's considered to be one of the three most reliable Greek manuscripts. So I don't think the scribes who were making some changes, maybe purposely, weren't trying to fool you. They were dedicated believers who were trying to correctly come up with what the Bible actually said. And certainly if they made those changes that they shouldn't have, it's going to be spotted. It's going to be known. And I point out, there's no autographs of the Book of Mormon. Gold plates were taken back by Moroni. The words in the Book of Mormon were altered over the years. Close to 4,000 changes. How could those changes have been made without the autograph? They didn't have anything to go off of. They just changed it. Well, those are scribal errors. Those are the printer's errors. Well, okay, he was supposed to have written it down word by word, and he was not allowed to continue to look into the hat so he could see the seer stone. It would not light up again until it was written correctly by Emma, by Martin, by Oliver. Those are the three main scribes. They weren't allowed to continue. And so I asked and I don't mean this to be pejorative or mean. I've asked Latter-day Saints when they're criticizing the Bible, I say, well, you believe the Bible is true as far as translated correctly. I notice in that it talks about the Book of Mormon being the Word of God, but it doesn't have that little statement there. Do you believe the Book of Mormon is true as far as it's translated correctly? Or should we try to go back to the earliest versions of the printer's manuscript to determine what it really would have said? Last thing I want to cover is the Bible contradictions. You get this all the time on the street. And here's the thing. There are apparent Bible contradictions, but when you take a look at at what is supposedly a contradiction, I think you're going to see very clearly it can be understood. So you have to look at the context. That's the most important part of any kind of Bible study, is understanding the context. And most times, it's just reading. They say read 7 verses before or 7 verses after. But so often we get people who will pull out a verse out of its context to make it say something it doesn't say. Classic point, 1 Corinthians 15:29, right? That why else are they then baptized? When you look at that verse and you look in the context, Paul, in the context of 1 Corinthians 15, is making a case for the resurrection of the body. Then all of a sudden, in verse 29, he changes to third person they, after he's been using I, we, us, we. Then all of a sudden he says they, and then he continues first person again. Look at the context. It's going to tell you that verse has been pulled out of its context, made into a proof text to say something that Paul never intended. Sometimes you're going to have different perspectives from different people. So you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John writing 4 different perspectives. Much of it's the same exactly, but some of it's going to be different. It's the reason why I believe that the synoptic gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very different from the Gospel of John. John writes his much later. He doesn't really use the sources that Matthew, Mark, and Luke had. Depending on your view, Mark was the first written. Others would say Matthew. There's debate over that. And however it was, they seem to have the same stories. And John is about 90% unique. Certainly has the same kinds of stories, but what he writes is completely different. Sometimes also the language is phenomenal rather than technical. The sun rises, the Bible says. Well, people say, there's a flat earth for you. The Bible rises, the sun sets. Well, don't they say that on the news all the time? Tomorrow's sunrise is going to be at 6:14 a.m. and the sunset is going to be at 6:19. Well, you guys must believe in a flat earth. It's phenomenal language. We use that kind of language. And so did the Bible in that kind of way. And so, and that's my point. You know, does the sun really rise? Obviously, I don't believe that the psalmist believed that the sun rises. He's just using that as that's what we see. That's how we feel. But I don't believe the Bible is a flat earth book at all. And then rounding up and down of numbers. Suppose this is Millard Erickson. He signed my diploma. He was the president of the university when I graduated from seminary. Christian doctrine. He said, suppose a hypothetical case in which the Bible recorded a battle in which 9,476 men were involved. What then would be a correct or infallible report? Would 10,000 be accurate? 9,000? 9,500? 9,480? 9,475? Or would only 9,476 be a correct report? The answer is that it depends upon the purpose of the writing. If the report is an official military account, which an officer is to submit to his superior, the number must be exact. That is the only way to ascertain whether there are any deserters. If, on the other hand, the account is simply to give some idea of the size of the battle, then a round number like 10,000 is adequate, and this setting is correct. You'll see differences between Kings and Samuel. You'll see some number differences, or Chronicles. You'll see numbers that, it's a little different. I mean, there could have been some errors in there, there's no doubt, and so you can see the notes that are written by the translators, but generally, you're going to have to give some freedom there. Now, for contradictions, in my book, we have on our website, mrm.org/Bible-passages, we have a whole list of the common passages that are used as contradictions. Another place would be Bible-contradictions. And I recommend 4 books. The Bible Handbook of Difficult Verses by Josh and Sean McDowell, and the Big Book of Bible Difficulties, Norm Geisler and Thomas Howell, Hard Sayings of the Bible by Peter Kaiser, and then When Cultus Asked by Geisler and Rhodes. Those 4 books go through in a chronological order and help you to understand how should this verse be understood and taken. And I think that can be really helpful, especially if you're a newer Christian and you're trying to figure these things out. Besides my websites, we have other websites out there as well. Carm.org is a really good one. They have things like that. So, you're taking a picture of that. If you want that there. And I'm wrapping it up. I have literally 1 minute left. Let me just tell you real quick. I have a table out there. It has these books on there. The newest one that I took those 2 chapters from, Introducing Christianity to Mormons. Mormonism 101 kind of compares the doctrines between Mormonism and Christianity. Answering Mormons' questions, 38 of the most common questions Latter-day Saints ask, and how we can answer those things. I wrote a book called Mormonism 101 for Teens. That is written more for a teenager who has LDS friends, and I'm trying to help them understand, because it's hard for us as adults to understand. That's difficult. And then sharing the good news with Mormons. Last thing, and I won't be able to take questions, I'm going to run out of time, but I will be at my table feel free to come and ask me questions. But let me just tell you real quick about the Utah Christian Research Center. And that's the name of our new center. MRM is put together with the blessing of Sandra Tanner. In fact, we have a lot of her library. We're going to have 4 major parts to this store that will be opening up in November of 2023. The first thing is we're going to have a bookstore, kind of like Sandra did at the Utah Lighthouse Bookstore. We're going to have Christian books. We're going to have books on Mormonism and some scholarly books on Mormonism. Ross's book his books are going to be in there. We're going to have a lot of really great selection of those books, but we also have a lot of apologetic works. And we hope that a lot of people can grow in their faith. Because you leave the church, most people end up going to atheism, agnosticism, or nothing at all. We don't want that to happen. We want you to have a good understanding of the strength of the Christian position. We also have an LDS library and a Christian library there. We are going to have some really rare books that won't necessarily be in our library. They're not checkout. It's not a checkout system, but in our museum display cases. And we're going to have a Bible museum. I go to Israel every year, and I bring home all these artifacts plus Bibles. You can go and see my 1615 Geneva Bible, complete Bible, on my table, and a 1634 King James. We're going to really put a lot of emphasis into Article 8, as far as it's translated correctly. We want to show you what the translation has done and where we're at today and why we can trust the Bible. And finally, we're going to have a classroom with about 30 seats. And so we're going to, starting next year, we're not going to do it right away. We're just trying to get this thing open. But we're going to have teaching sessions. If you would like to learn more about that, I have a sheet in the back table. You put your email address, print nicely so we can read it. We do a monthly center update. And we're going to invite you to November 2, 3, and 4. We're doing, it's a private for pastors and for people that are on that list to come and see what we're going to do. So if you're interested in that, sign that. You'll be invited. Otherwise, we're going to take 3 weeks off after that. And then Black Friday, we're going to do our first day. So we're going to open up that day. So anyway, thank you so much. I hope that wasn't too much information, but hopefully you were able to get some of that. And if I confused you, I'd be in the back to wrap that up. God bless you guys.